Hi, everybody. Welcome to Hatch Global, another Thursday with another interesting speaker. Today we have Cyrus Massoumi, and I'll introduce him in just 1 second. But first of all, our partners for Hatch Global, Hatch in Sri Lanka and Pakistan is a place for innovation, growth, and collaboration. It is a center for gravity for all things startups. The vision of Hatch is to transform the business culture by providing genuine opportunities for entrepreneurs to experiment freely. BYLC Ventures from Bangladesh was created to help passionate young founders get kick-started with their big ideas. They do this by providing technical support to validate a product or a solution and seed funding to go fast to market. Seed Ventures in Pakistan, a social entrepreneurship and equity development organization working on supporting and promoting entrepreneurship across various landscapes and verticals, working extensively with micro enterprises, small, medium enterprises, and startups as well. And Pro Pakistani is Pakistan's largest independent publisher of tech, business, and other news, with over 136 million traffics to its site. Well, Cyrus Massoumi is the managing partner and the founder of Ambition, an early-stage venture firm focused on New York City startups. Prior to Ambition, Cyrus founded ZocDoc, where he led the company for 8 years as CEO. Early in his career, he was at McKinsey, and also he's a graduate of Columbia Business School and also Wharton School as well, University of Pennsylvania. Cyrus is a member of the board of overseas Columbia Universities and Mailman School of Public Health, and has been recognized by Fortune and Cranes on its 40 under 40 list. And also he's one of the most creative people named by Fast Company as well. So Cyrus, thank you for joining us and being part of Hatch Global Talks. It's great to have someone with so much experience join us. And also it's in the pandemic world, what you've done in the past becomes even more relevant today. So welcome to South Asia.
Thank you for having me. It's great to talk to you all.
So Cyrus, just to talk through ZocDoc, how did it happen? I know you had a personal incident which kicked everything off. How did you start ZocDoc, and what was the reason you started ZocDoc?
Sure. So it was 2007. I was flying across the US and I had a really bad sinus infection. And my plane landed, and the pressure from the landing resulted in me rupturing an eardrum. So I needed to I wanted to find an ear, nose, and throat specialist, and I started to look. And in the US, when you're booking healthcare, you typically start with your insurance carrier because they all have these individual networks of doctors that tell you who you can go see. And each of these insurance carriers have a website. I went to my insurance carrier's website and I started calling physicians. I really had no idea who was good, and as I was calling, a lot of the phone numbers didn't work, and in one case I called a doctor who was actually deceased. And I thought to myself, I do everything else in my life is happening on the internet. Why does healthcare have to be done in this archaic way where I'm calling doctors who are no longer practicing or have passed away? There had to be a better way. And so I quit my job at McKinsey and spent 6 months just figuring out what a solution would look like, and then put my head down and really just tried to build the business.
And when you started the business, what was the original thinking of the idea? Was it just a booking platform? Is that what you were looking at, or?
Yeah, I initially wanted to have people just book appointments. We started only with dentists. So I think one of the key learnings that I'd seen from people who built successful local marketplaces is those that were the most focused at the onset ended up being the most successful. They could have had grand ambitions, but they really, I think that's a lesson that surprises me more people have not derived from Steve Jobs' success when he returned to Apple. Right? Focus is perhaps one of the most powerful forces in business. And I remember when we started, there were several competitors, and every single one of them had more money than us, Every single one of them had a CEO that was more experienced than I was, and had more success than I was, that I'd had professionally. And in some ways, the lack of resources was a benefit, because everyone else tried to do everything everywhere, and we just hyper-focused in one place. And so we started with just bookings. We did it just with dentistry. We spent 3.5 years doing dentists just in New York. And then we started to expand geographies. We started to expand specialties. And over the next 5-6 years, we launched pretty much every medical specialty, 50 different medical specialties across every single American state. So took it to a point where you could actually book everything from a circumcision to marriage counseling all on one platform. And we learned a lot along the way, and literally just did it in increments, just constantly getting better along the way. And through the pandemic, ZocDoc has been expanding into other areas. So one of the other challenges in the U.S. is medical records, and you have to fill out lots of paperwork every time you go to a doctor, every single time. And so we enabled people to fill it in once and pre-fill it out for them in all of their doctor's offices, and we started doing that. And then through this pandemic, I no longer run the company, but there's been a lot of push for ZocDoc to start doing more telemedicine on the platform. And so the platform shifted to being heavily telemedicine oriented, as one can imagine, when everyone's sheltering in place.
And most of the companies in this space struggle from two issues. One is when they go to the doctors ask, how many consumers do you have on your platform? When you go to the consumer, they say, how many doctors do you have on the platform? So how did you get through the first doctors, and what was the selection criteria?
So we started with dentists, and it was very difficult to get the time of day at the onset. And so what I did was, the two schools that I'd gone to, the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia, I went through both schools have a dental school, both universities have a dental school. And so I went to their alum, and I started reaching out just for early product feedback, and tried to get them to, through those conversations, agree to be the early testers in the platform. This is now the fall of 2007. We were planning to launch the company towards the end in Q4, maybe in October, November of 2007. And TechCrunch, of course, a big tech blog, had their first conference ever, which they called the TechCrunch 40. Previously, it was called TechCrunch Disrupt. And we applied, and out of several thousand companies, we were one of the 40 slots that were able to launch our company on stage at their conference. And they are accelerating our launch, which was already compressed from 4 months to 2 months. And so we had to launch this in September instead of November. And I remember that my two co-founders were both of them were technical. I was not. So I was tasked with signing the doctors up and testing the app. And I remember the one request that we had was to have enough dentists on the platform at the beginning. So if you did a search, there was enough dentists to actually have a scroll bar just in Manhattan where we went. And I remember it was really the first week of September 2007. And I didn't have enough dentists to have my scroll bar. We had 4, and I needed maybe 9 or 10. And there was one dentist practice in Lower Manhattan called Premier Dental Associates, which is it's the closest dentist office to the Twin Towers that fell in 9/11. And most doctors and dentists left that neighborhood. They decided to stay. And I remember they had 6 dentists, and the lead dentist there had agreed to potentially bring on all 6 of them, which would have been enough to give me my scroll bar. And so he said, come to my office for us to meet. And so I got there. I was there when the office opened at 8:30 a.m. And I sat in the waiting room. And the office manager didn't let me in to see the dentist. And I sat in the waiting room till about 5:30 p.m. And literally I spent the entire day just waiting for the dentist to meet me. And I think they felt so sorry for me. They finally let me in and they let me on board other dentists. So after spending 9 hours waiting for him, I was able to have my scroll bar. We launched at TechCrunch. And, we had all of this press. And we expected that we were going to run out of dentist appointments. We're like, oh, we spent actually a reasonable amount of time, a few days, building all this logic. What happens? We have no more appointments, and we can tell people, that there are, come back later, and we'll have doctor's appointments. We launched, and we had all this press. We were in TechCrunch and dozens of other media outlets, and nobody booked appointments. Nobody booked an appointment. It took us. We kept hitting refresh. We thought something was wrong, and it took us 2 days to get our first appointment. And that first appointment was fake. And, I share this because getting marketplaces are among the best businesses to be able to grow if you can get the initial spark. But the initial spark never comes quickly. Marketplaces are always difficult and they require persistence. But once you build them, the liquidity makes them very difficult to disrupt. Right. And ZocDoc was not an overnight success. Despite everyone who at the beginning was sort of a naysayer. It took them about 3 or 4 years to come around, and it was really. Then all of a sudden, people thought we were an overnight success, but it literally was not. It was 4 years of just putting our heads down and doing everything possible in this small geography of New York to get the liquidity. First in dentistry, then in primary care doctors, and that's all we did the first 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, telemedicine has moved on, and now a lot of consultation takes place through telemedicine. So, in your experience, there's a lot of skepticism that you would have come across from the doctor's side, and there would have been skepticism on the consumer or onboarding side as well. So, could you share a little bit about the skepticism that you went through in your early days?
Sure. So. I think oftentimes people are adverse to change, and a lot of doctors, especially those that have been practicing for quite some time, are adverse to the new technologies and to the change. I remember a lot of physicians, and to be clear, ZocDoc, in the time I was running it, we did not have telemedicine on the platform. We were just doing the online bookings. But a lot of the criticisms that I had gotten were, I'm only going to get weird patients. Patients like speaking to my staff. They enjoy it. It's a good part of their experience. Patients are, in order to build trust in the community, we facilitated reviews on the platform. And doctors were worried because historically reviews have only been negative. People would seek out review platforms and leave negative reviews on them. And so they were worried about what would happen with patients who are now giving a platform to comment. They were worried about how logistically things would work because now they have people scheduling. And so each one of these things, when it became the chief complaint, we just one at a time just went through and figured out how to solve them. And eventually it worked.
And you spoke about just focusing on dentistry and then moving into other areas. A lot of companies make this mistake. They grow too fast. They grow into different cities, and then they have these other areas that they want to get in, and suddenly they have all these other different revenue lines that they're looking at. So when did you decide you were ready, number one, to move into another area, and number two, move into another city? What was the decision-making matrix that you used for that?
So we actually waited until New York was on a path to profitability, and it was clear that it could be a self-sustaining business. And once we were comfortable with that, we said, okay, now let's go expand into city number 2. The problem was that there was the capital markets were closed. It was like during the Great Recession. It's not too dissimilar from what may be happening soon, and so we didn't have the money to go. We wanted to go to Washington D.C. because it was close enough that we could take the train there from New York within a few hours. but we didn't have the money to expand there. So I was at a breakfast for one of our angel investors, and someone there had mentioned that there was a competition on Forbes magazine called Boost Your Business, where you could enter and they would give you $100,000 if you won. And I thought it was crazy. Like, what are the odds that we can win this and use this money to fund our expansion? I ended up applying. We did our entire company pitch in rhyme, and it was multiple steps throughout the process. And in the end, we ended up winning. It took 6 months for us to get the check from Forbes. Then we did, and we were able to effectively use that money to expand. And we spent another year and change in DC. I mean, to relearn many of the things that we'd learned in New York at the onset. We weren't sure if it was a trend or what have you. We relearned those things and then made our multi-hundred row spreadsheet of what it's required to launch a market, and then just took it one market at a time from there.
And you had a couple of interesting investors, Jeff Bezos and Mark Benioff, come into ZocDoc, and how did you convince them to get in? And was it early on, or was it towards the end of your tenure?
So it was early on. They invested in the Series A, which was in 2008, a year after we launched and changed. It was important to me to get existing operators involved and people who'd built big businesses that have been transformative. Jeff Bezos was one of the, he was friends with one of our existing investors. And so we met them, and they positioned us as the Amazon of healthcare. And, I would give them all the credit in bringing that investor on. Mark Benioff, the TechCrunch conference that I mentioned that we launched at, we got invited back the following year just to participate, and Mark Benioff was talking. And we were trying to figure out a way to stand out in the crowd. And, these conferences, people are always hungry and tired, and the food's typically not that great. And so we found a restaurant that made very good homemade chicken soup. And so we just started giving away chicken soup to get people to sort of come to our booth and to talk to us about our company. And Mark Benioff was there, and I literally just walked up to him and just started cold pitching him out of the blue. And within, he asked me a couple of questions. The entire interaction had been 5 minutes, and then he agreed to invest. And it's interesting because in his case, I definitely was asking him questions along the way. Every 6 months to a year, I would just fire off some updates, and he would ask me questions. I'd ask him questions. Of anyone of that level of success, I'd never seen anyone be that responsive to anyone else. My own vendors didn't respond to me as quickly as Mark Benioff did, which I was really amazed by. I mentioned that going through the whole Great Recession, the only ZocDoc investor who actually stepped up. He doubled down and invested more during that time, which was really meaningful for us. And I'm not even sure the company probably wouldn't have been around had he not done that. So, we've thankfully, I've introduced him to a few of the companies that we've invested in, and he's invested in as well. And that's been a great experience. So I feel as though I've been able to do a small part in reciprocating, but he was really a great individual. And for me, an example of what I aspire to be like in an investor and supporting entrepreneurs.
Cyrus, when you were, Asia is just getting into the whole telemedicine space now, and that comes from the remote areas of different parts of this, this region, and secondly, also the lack of access to affordable healthcare as well. So, what was some of the learnings that you had or in this market that you believe will be useful for some of these companies starting out? And if you had to go back to 2007, what would you have done differently?
So I think what's made the hindrance to telemedicine in the US has simply been payments and figuring out how the payment flows would work. I'm not familiar with the healthcare systems in the markets you're discussing, but I know that probably the most successful implementation of telemedicine in the U.S. was a company called One Medical Group, which is it's a concierge medical practice that has a pretty expansive web presence as well. And the way in which their pricing worked, they could afford to give the telemedicine away for free because they would get these annual fees from their members, and on top of getting fees whenever someone had to come into the office. The big telemedicine boom in the U.S. has really taken hold post-COVID, and the reason is that the government has enabled physicians to get paid for their consultations, even if they didn't have a pre-existing relationship with the patient. And so there have been a lot of laws stipulating that, yes, you could do telemedicine, but you may not get compensated the same, but you'll get compensated, but you need to have an existing relationship. And with COVID, all of those restrictions have gone out the door. You can see patients regardless of whether or not you had a pre-existing relationship. You can charge them as you normally would charge a patient. And I think what's been seen is that there still needs to be to truly replicate a doctor's office visit. There need to be some other technologies that I think need to become more prevalent, such as home diagnostics. There's a couple of cool companies that are doing things in home diagnostics where you literally would have certain tests you could do on your own in your home, etc. But in many respects, the barriers in the U.S. predominantly have just been to get the payments aligned with how care wants to be delivered.
And you spoke about home diagnostics, and we've seen a huge increase in wearables. Apple has been leading it, about Fitbits and the other devices as well. And you're seeing a huge movement in that home diagnostics space with COVID as well, in terms of testing, etc. How real is it, or is it just because of COVID? Do you think that people are much more comfortable, or is it here to stay? Because I was reading Seema Verma, I think the Medicare Senate official, or soon to be official, was saying that there was a 40-fold increase in use of telemedicine in the US during the COVID period, and she would like it to stay. So all of this is really positive for startups in that particular space.
It's interesting, the whole quantified self movement, which I would agree with you, I would put under the umbrella of diagnostics. It's been, the results admittedly have been mixed. I think in many cases, my experience, and I bought a bunch of devices, and most of them after about a month end up in the drawer after I get the initial sets of data. Where I think the future is, and I'm looking to invest in, if anyone listening has a company like this, I'm looking to invest. I think the future of home diagnostics is likely in the toilet, literally. I think going in and analyzing, maybe in the toothbrush or in the toilet, looking things you're ordinarily doing, being able to determine how you're doing, taking your vital signs as such, where it just makes that entire interaction better and feeds that data into your care delivery, I think is super relevant. I'm not a big believer that the majority of consumers will buy wearables and do a great job of managing. I think there's a segment that will be adamant about it, but I think that's a small minority, unfortunately. So I think we need to figure out a way to make it simpler and closer to people's lives. An interesting anecdote about New York. Obviously, the U.S. is a very heavy dog culture. We consider our dogs like family members. I have my dog sitting here right next to me. And in New York, when they introduced the laws requiring people to pick up the poop of their dogs when they're walking them, which happened maybe 20 years ago, the life expectancy of dogs went up on average about a year. And it was interesting that analyzing the poop is sort of one of the easiest ways to determine the overall health. And I think being able to do it at a molecular level for humans would be incredibly valuable.
And staying with that, what I mean, people are always nervous with the likes of Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple playing in that space, and you know, it's only a matter of time before they feel that space is important, and each one of them have got their own health unit that's looking at various things. So what do you think the future of telemedicine with the likes of Amazon, Google, and Facebook and Apple coming into play as well?
I mean, it's interesting. Amazon had a very high-profile initiative with J.P. Morgan that ended up not getting called Haven, which never ended up taking off. You know, the concern of healthcare, and I think one of the hindrances to innovation in the U.S. has been just the amount of regulation. And in many ways, it made things very complicated for us at ZocDoc as well. You couldn't just do what was the right product decision. You had to sort of weave the delicate balance between what was right for the product and what you needed to do for regulatory compliance reasons. So, you know, I'm not sure I believe that the largest companies are going to be willing to do the things necessary to innovate, because innovation may require companies to live in an area that has not been clearly defined in the law. So these companies already have big targets on their backs. You know, whenever one is a captain of industry and you have that much power over the consumer or over society, becomes a bit of a magnifying glass. And I think in order to do some of the things that will be required to take huge steps forward, there will need to be a certain amount of trust that these companies will have a difficult time managing simply because of their existing scale and the existing levels of scrutiny that they have. So it could be that through acquisitions they get involved in this space, but I think the early innovation is really going to be coming from the smallest companies.
And staying on that, how do you make sure that you know, your privacy of health records is a key reason that administration is holding things back?
How do you make sure that the records remain private? Is that what your question is?
Yes. Sorry, I think we cut out for a second there. I was asking on the privacy side of it and just confidentiality of health data itself. What did you go through to ensure that whatever your clients are showing, and now it's a different business for ZocDoc, has been protected as well?
So I think that one of the main we would treat healthcare data like it was money. And we put the same level of protections that a bank would use to protect your money to protecting data. And even it down to who had access to what within our, you know, we had to create layers within our own engineering teams to really restrict what data you could see and who could see it and when they could see it. You know, there were obviously a lot of laws that govern consumer privacy in healthcare, like HIPAA, but as written, HIPAA, which is the main consumer healthcare privacy law in the US, doesn't actually cover a lot of these new technologies, especially if the relationship is not originating from the provider. If you originate the relationship yourself, you're not a provider, and you maybe connect people to providers. Technically, HIPAA is not applicable, but we would act as though it was. And so it was absolutely critical for us from a health, just a general security perspective, we brought in a senior executive to focus on data security probably earlier than most companies would, just because of the nature of what we were dealing with. But it's a healthcare security. The security of healthcare data is a big challenge, and there are people who are hackers who are going to large providing organizations in the U.S. and they are literally holding their data ransom. And it's actually not talked about heavily, but it's a big problem, and it's something that thankfully at ZocDoc we've never encountered. But I know that within healthcare, it's something that that people are very, very worried about.
And just finally, as we're touching on privacy and the insurance companies are not people's most friendliest companies in the world. So how important are the insurance companies in this whole game, and how important is it to get them on your side right at the beginning?
So the majority of healthcare in the U.S. is paid for by the insurers. And to put this in perspective in terms of scale, healthcare in the U.S. represents 20% of our GDP. It's the largest and the fastest growing portion of the GDP. And the vast majority of those payment flows are flowing through the insurance companies. So they have quite a bit of influence in how things work and how healthcare is run. And there's a lot of unfortunately, suboptimal decisions for the consumers that are made along that chain. We had early on with ZocDoc, one of the key insights that we had was being able to give people the information, knowing what doctors accepted, what insurance was kind of the killer feature at the very beginning. We didn't need the insurance companies to do that. Doctors themselves would tell us, I take this insurance, I don't take that insurance. But there's literally thousands of different plans. And each doctor maybe takes 20% of them. So it's like as if you wanted to go into the mall and buy something and the store only accepted out of 1,000 different types of credit cards that could be accepted, they only accept like 10. And you have to hope that you have one of those 10 or you can't buy the thing that you want. And so solving that problem for people became a pretty critical feature. And it was interesting because we almost launched ZocDoc without it. And one of the consumers that we did interviews with early on was a hedge fund manager who'd been quite successful and was quite well to do. And this gentleman had told us that he did not, he was afraid to go to a doctor who was not part of his insurance network. And I was so floored. I'm like, you have so much money. Why do you even care? He's like, I'm just afraid of the paperwork. Because if you go to a doctor who's not in your insurance network, they just send you you get 20 envelopes of letters of number with calculations you don't understand and people demanding things from you. And it's just this huge stress. So, part of solving this problem in the US, at least, I think is going to have to be a simplification of all of this. And I very much believe that simplification needs to be consumer-led. It can't be business-led because it's not be powerful enough change.
So there's a question that's come in from Fariha Tasnim from Bangladesh. She's saying, how can startups provide healthcare support using health tech in areas that lack tech infrastructure, especially in a country like Bangladesh, where a majority of the population resides outside the capital and the internet connectivity is extremely poor?
So, I believe, mostly when people are thinking of telemedicine, they're thinking of video chatting like we're doing right now.
Right.
I think in many cases, if you look at the most successful implementations, like One Medical Group, which I talked about, or there's a company called Galileo that our venture fund is an investor in, started by the former founder of One Medical Group. A lot of telemedicine consultations can happen asynchronously. They can happen over text. And if that is the case, I would argue they don't even need to have internet access. As long as you can text message, you theoretically could do something. And at a base level, I wouldn't worry about the person-to-person interaction. I think the winning models won't actually be video interaction. I think people don't like to be in video. You know, I had to, if we weren't having this video chat today, I may have waited a few hours before I took my morning shower, or maybe not have, combed my hair in the right way. And so, these things add to the barriers to people wanting to do various things. And I think, for me, texting would just be a lower barrier for more people to get involved in various things. So I would just, think about how existing technologies can accommodate, and chances are that's actually what's going to win in the end anyway, because that's what's winning here.
And there's another question from Sadul Chan. How do you see the future of e-health and telemedicine integrating with efficiency of drug discovery facilitated by companies such as Benchling?
So I don't know the company that they're referencing, but I do believe that drug discovery is about to go through a major renaissance. How we've discovered drugs for the past 30 years has fundamentally not changed. And people are realizing now that it is actually a data science problem. It can be a data science problem that you can use AI, machine learning, to do drug discovery. And in the last 12 months, the number of companies I've seen that have been talking about that have literally mushroomed. Right. And in that equation, being able to, even if it's something as simple as understanding different uses for existing drugs, data can be hugely valuable for that, right? Understanding that, and so if you have what they call the phenotypical data, that what we're experiencing in our our chief complaints, or whatever our various personal health elements are, and you can sort of even just marry that with data on the drugs people are taking, you can learn something about how to repurpose what's out there. And if you take it a step further, I very much believe that we don't need to do all these complicated, very expensive trials in the earliest stages to learn what may work. I think there's ways we can do it through AI, and I'm very excited about the pace of which drug discovery is about to accelerate. And I think, especially as it relates to certain diseases that may be less profitable, things that the Gates Foundation cares about, it's less profitable for a for-profit pharmaceutical company to come out with a solution, but it is a serious public health issue nonetheless. I'm hopeful that through making drug discovery cheaper and faster, that we can help solve many of those problems that exist across the globe.
And do you think the FDA timelines could be shortened through this type of use of data?
Absolutely. I think the FDA will need to modernize itself as well, but we're already seeing that it's really been impressive actually how fast the FDA has been able to move on things during the pandemic. And I think rethinking that model is going to be critical to helping healthcare advance.
Well, another question that's come in, and there's lots of questions that's coming in, so I'll just try and pick one or two of these. Maradani Devanagam has asked, practically for those who need interventions, doctors and medical centers in several cities, who do you have contact with several centers to deliver these services? So what she's asking is the future of medicine really having a hub and spoke model, and having centers where digitized information could be captured much more accurately?
It's interesting. So New York, looking at the US as an example, doctors very much used to all be independent. When I started ZocDoc, 70% of doctors were self-employed. And over the past decade and a half, that number has shifted. So only 30% are now self-employed. So physicians are becoming part of the large academic medical centers. When that happens, however, the physicians lose a lot of autonomy. They lose just an ability to make the right decisions by the patients. So it's true that these large academic medical centers have huge investments in technology, but it's not to say that, from an information technology perspective, these are things that can be offered to individual practices as well, if made simple enough and good, easy to use and reliable, etc. I think that there's probably going to be I think we're starting to see the beginnings of what is a swinging back of the pendulum to doctors wanting to be more independent, wanting to be able to make the right decisions by their patients. Doctors are frustrated if they're part of a large academic medical center. The reason why the academic medical center or the large health system had largely employed them was because they wanted to make more money from it, right? They wanted to take the primary care doctor who they're now employing and have them refer to their specialist who are doing their procedures in their hospitals. And doctors don't feel great about that. If they don't think that specialist is the best specialist for the patient, they don't want to make those referrals. And that creates a huge problem for the business cases that these health systems use to employ doctors. I think the average doctor that's employed by a health system, the health system loses between $100,000 and $300,000 per year, or the various statistics that I've seen. So I think there's probably going to be a pendulum swinging back to the individual practitioner. And I think that it'll be the technologies that are able to accommodate and simplify. And it could be in a different world where my dad, who's a doctor, an independent physician, had his own practice, had his own staff. Maybe there's a shared office model. And we've seen a bunch of companies like that where he's basically, everything else is managed through the shared service, but he at least is able to make his own decisions. Right. And the billing and everything else is managed by a third party. So in the US, I think that's how it's going to evolve. I do think that it's, the more that we leave patients' care in doctors' hands, the more likely the right thing is going to happen. US, we talk about, there's 300 plus million, 350 million people in the United States. 91 million of those people do not have either access to healthcare or have health plans that are meaningless for them, that they literally cannot go to the doctor because doing so would be economically prohibitive because they have to pay the first X hundreds of dollars out of pocket and they don't have the money. So it's literally close to between a quarter and a third of Americans are unable to access our own healthcare system, which if you look at New York, prior to the Great Depression, we had solved that problem 80 years ago, and now it's become unsolved. And the way that it worked is that patients would see, this is the way that my family's ethically Iranian, and my grandfather used to do this. He would go and see his patients in his private practice a few days a week, and then 1 or 2 days a week, he'd see people in his public practice, and he would see people for free. Yeah. And he's self-regulated. And New York did that. Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, reserved for the private patients, and Wednesday was reserved for the needy. People would come in, they would line up, and they would get seen. And doctors managed to make sure that everyone had care. And the fact that it's 80 years later and we have less people accessing that, I think is a huge problem. So though not her original question, I'm all for returning the power to the doctor because I think that will be better for healthcare across the board.
That's a great statement. I mean, I think we're seeing that across the world as well. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you was we're in this COVID period. A lot of people have got onto telemedicine and the use of that. But the crisis of getting onto your business side and the experience you have on that, you started a company during potentially the largest financial crisis the world has ever seen in 2007 onwards. So how did you go through that period? Because it must have been really difficult. Here's a new tech that you've got, there is a market for it, and then suddenly this avalanche comes down. So how did you cope through that? And is there any experience that you can pick out of that to say, okay, today this is what you need to do in this new crisis that we're in?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things that really benefited us. I think being in that environment, we didn't have the pressure to grow at all costs. We could really focus on building something valuable. And, I think that the great SoftBank experiment of the last few years has suggested that capital alone cannot a great company make, right? You need to have other ingredients. And so I really looked at it as an advantage. I could go in and learn things, and the things I was learning couldn't be replicated in 50 other American cities because the capital markets were closed. So I was going to be able to, without having to burn a lot of money, learn in one market and then use those learnings and expand broadly across the US. So that was very helpful. The second thing that was very helpful right now, it's really difficult. Up until the last 6 months, it's been very difficult to hire in the US, like people that are really exceptional. If you're a company, if you just think of the companies that make the biggest transformations in the world, it's oftentimes not the first idea, it's the second derivative on that idea that enabled them to become huge companies, right? Microsoft was not born with Microsoft Windows. It was born with DOS, and then 10 years later, they came out with Windows. Apple was not born with the Mac. That came later. Yeah, and the people who make the Mac or make the iPhone or the iPod, the iPhone, those people, when you have capital markets that are almost irrational, every single one of those people goes out and becomes an entrepreneur. And so they could have been an entrepreneur, building a company, innovating within that company and helping it get to the next step function. But instead they're building something in a different organization. And so I think that the ability in tougher economic times to aggregate talent is much more powerful than people appreciate, and is much more of a benefit than the loss of capital markets being as open as they had been previously. And I think that is, I can't underscore that enough. And I prefer running companies in leaner economic times, because then it's really about how well you execute and not how lucky you got because of whatever term sheet or however much money your competitor or you are irrationally choosing to spend.
Well, you have a little bit of a Midas touch because you invested in companies like ClassPass, Refinery 29, and I remember Compass as well, who have done extremely well in your investment thesis. So in your new role as a venture capitalist, sitting on the other side, number one, what are you seeing in the new markets at the moment? And I know that the second question attached to that is, you always believe in investing in good founders and supporting those founders as well. So what are you seeing out there post-COVID? Are you seeing any greater ideas, or are you seeing a much more acceleration in particular industries?
So, a few things. Like I definitely was lucky in my my angel investing, and I think that hopefully the luck will persist through our fund. But one of the things that's interesting about all the companies you mentioned, across the board, founders asked me to get involved. I told them no. I may have told them no 2 or 3 times, and they just kept coming back and having made more progress, and I would help them a little bit, and then they kept on succeeding, etc. And I got involved literally because I just was as an entrepreneur, I had so much empathy for their persistence, that's what drew me to them. I wasn't actually trying to maximize my economic return. Now, the irony of that is they all ended up becoming successful companies, and they did well, but that's not even why I invested. And what it tells me is that I think people over-index, and I would say they over-index on other, like they over-index on an idea, they over-index on a lot of like strategic questions, and they under-index on the founder and the founder's persistence and the founder's grit. And one of the things that's really important to me is, being able to determine how gritty a founder is, and the likelihood that they'll just never give up. And I think that's that's been a big piece of how I think about investing. And I think what's made me lucky and successful thus far. In terms of COVID and understanding that, there's absolutely a lot of companies that are, I'd say probably about 20% of the investing presentations that we are seeing were businesses that were designed specifically because of COVID. So to see that innovation turn around, and they already have traction, they have users, they have customers, to have gone through this, already developed a company, have users that are in some cases paying you. It's been pretty impressive, and it gives me hope that no matter what, it's been a very crazy year. 2020 will go down as probably the craziest year I've lived through. I'm waiting for like the meteorites to come next month, or the aliens to land, or whatever. I'm not going to be surprised, and whatever it is, but it really gives me hope that regardless of what that is, humanity is one true thing, which is humanity will find a way to innovate, and will find a way to survive, and find a way to thrive. And if we can be a small part of helping that, making that happen, you're very humble to say all the positive things about me, but our fund exists because of people like you supporting us early on. And so I think ultimately, as long as we keep supporting each other and creating cool, innovative businesses, I think humanity is going to be fine.
So I know we're running out of time, and the one final question that I have is, there's been a lot of noise with regards to the protests, etc. I know you live in Soho; you would have seen a lot of that as well. I hope everything gets under control, and we're with you out in the US as well as you find resolution to some of these issues. But thank you again, Cyrus, and thank you for all the support that you've given us as well throughout the years. And if there's anything finally you'd like to say about any of the things that we've spoken, here's your chance to say it.
I would just say, health is it's the most critical of human needs. And I'm excited to know that across the world, people are innovating in health tech. And, Nathan has been a good friend and partner over the years to us. And, anyone that may need help that, you're close with, please feel free to use me as a resource, and I'll do my best to help out.
Cyrus, thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you face to face sometime in New York, or you in Sri Lanka, or some part of South Asia.
I was going to ask, are you going on any of your long walks? Have you motivated?
Not in the near future. Just building the hospital at the moment. Thanks.
All right. Cheers. Bye bye.
Take care. Bye bye.
Take care. Bye bye.